Chris Eubank Jr. versus George Grove. Not the fight I anticipated. Chris Eubank Jr. it looked like the guy was scared in there. The guy was scared to let his hands go. That's why I picked Chris Eubank Jr. to win the fight. Chris Eubank Jr. went in there, and he's scared to let his hands go. He let George Grove dictated the pace, kept the jab in his face, outboxed him for the first 6 rounds. I mean, they were swing rounds, but George Grove just kept outboxing him, countering him. And I forget what round it was, but Chris Eubank Jr. It was in the early rounds, I believe, like the second or third round, if I'm not mistaken. Chris Eubank Jr. and George Grove clashed heads. Chris Eubank Jr. had a big cut on his eye, his right eye. It was so deep, man. I thought the ref was gonna stop it, but good thing it was a clash of head, not a punch, because George Groves would have won the fight if the referee had stopped the fight. The referee kept breaking him up, wasn't letting Chris Eubank Jr. do his work. You know, Chris Eubank does most of his work on the inside. Every time Chris Eubank Jr. get on the inside and throws his uppercuts or tries to work, the referee would break it off. It's like the referee was paid to take Eubank off of George Grove. And George Groves, he kept showing UFC moves, putting Chris Eubank Jr. in a headlock. He would get him every time, put him in a headlock and throw him through the ropes. I mean, every time they clinched, the referee would take them apart. That's when I knew Chris Eubank was going to lose the fight. Every time they clinched, the referee would pull him apart. He wouldn't let Chris Eubank Jr. work on the inside. George Groves, there was one time in one round, it looked like George Groves threw like an elbow on the back of Chris Eubank's back. It was crazy. George Groves, but he fought at his pace. I have to give George Groves a lot of credit. He fought at his pace. Chris Eubank Jr., he didn't start off how we thought he was going to start off. That's when I knew the fight was in jeopardy. From the very first round, when he let George Grove take control of the temple, he let George Grove do whatever he wanted. He gave George Grove confidence. He should have went in there and bullied a bigger man. He let the bigger man, kept him away with a jab. I picked Chris Eubank Jr. to win the fight. I'm not gonna lie. I'm sorry that I picked Chris Eubank Jr. to win the fight, because you know what? I didn't really look at George Groves. I didn't really look at all his fights. The only fights that I did see of George Groves, those was top competition, and he lost those fights against top competition. You know, so that's why I picked Chris Eubank Jr. to win the fight. Chris Eubank Jr. just was gun shy, man. The way he came out in the last 3 rounds was unbelievable. The way he was trying to take George Groves. At one point in the 12th round, I thought he was going to stop him. At one point in the 12th round, I thought he was going to stop George Groves. He had him against the rope. But then all of a sudden, I seen George Groves bobbing and weaving, moving his head, hands down and everything. And it looked like George Groves injured his shoulder. And he was still in there, bobbing and weaving and still moving his head. I picked George Groves to lose this fight by knockout. I picked him to get KO'd by Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. was going to overwhelm him, swarm him, and just pretty much just stop George Grove in his track. George Grove proved to be the bigger man. I mean, it was unbelievable what George Grove did in there. He just kept Chris Eubank off with just the jab, man. Chris Eubank Jr. just couldn't get a shot at that jab. The bigger man just bullied him with the jab. Wow. I never knew George Grove was a good boxer. George Grove, he shocked me. He showed me he's boxing. If you're a boxer, you can stop the aggressive guy. You can keep him off with the jab. I mean, he kept him off with the jab, and Chris Eubank Jr. just was neutralized until the last 3 rounds when he kept going for broke. But it was a masterclass performance by George Groves. Congrats to George Groves. Chris Eubank Jr. just couldn't find his range, man. He just couldn't find his range. He was just giving up these rounds. He was just letting George Groves just dominate. I mean, I kept looking for rounds to give Chris Eubank Jr. There was a few rounds I wanted to give him, but I mean, George Groves it was just a jab fest, man. I mean, Billy Joe Saunders was right. George Groves, Chris Eubank Jr. is not really a boxer. He wants to brawl, man. It was Chris Eubank Jr., I'm sure he shocked a lot of people, man. One of those people being me. I will admit I did pick him to win, but he just got simply outboxed and outclassed by the bigger man. George Groves looked like a 175-pounder in there, and all that probably played a factor in Chris Eubank Jr. defeat. But at the end of the day, Chris Eubank Jr. didn't show up. He just got outclassed, man. At the end of the 12th round, Chris Eubank Jr. clearly went for broke. He was trying to take this guy head off, but it was a clear unanimous decision on all three judges' scorecard. All three judges scored was favor St. George Groves. He won the fight convincingly. He beat Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. is going to get a lot of heat. This is the same Chris Eubank Jr. that was talking smack about